welcome! This is going to be our second module in a series of 3 modules that look at the cardiovascular system. Earlier we looked at the blood, and now we are ready to move on to look at the pump that drives the movement of this liquid media in the vasculature. So our topic on this chapter will be the heart. In fact, the reason why I am particularly excited of this chapter is that much of my research career has been spent on working on the cardiac research field. What I am especially interested in is the cardiac imaging, in particular with the MRI, and to be much more precise, the coronary vessel imaging and the survival prediction based on novel imaging analysis methods. So this is something that I am very excited to share with you. The heart is really, in my opinion, an amazing organ. It starts to beat at very early in the development, about 22 days after fertilization, although it is not seen until later, about 5 weeks after the last period. When does the heart stop beating then? Yes, at death. But throughout the entire time, from when it starts to first beat at day 22 after fertilization to when we die and our body system stop working, heart never stops to rest. And a few numbers that highlight the amazing work that the heart does are that it beats about 7,000 liters of blood each day, and at about 2.5 billion beats throughout a lifetime. Imagine it never rests throughout that time, always working tirelessly. So the heart is really important for us, and we can see this with some of the terminology too. You can have heard about your heart jumping out of your chest, or you can have your heart broken. We can have a heartache. We wish someone well from the bottom of our heart, or ask someone to have some heart when we are asking for understanding. Doing something immediately happens in a heartbeat. How about my heart goes out to you when something bad has happened? Can you die out of a broken heart? See, there are many examples. So clearly for a long time, we have known that the heart is a very important organ. Even to such a point that back in the day, it was thought that your soul was located in your heart, rather than being a creation of your brain. We still hear some making references to have nothing but good intentions in their heart. What is very interesting to me is that all of the cardiovascular systems are not alike from one species to another. Here we can see, for example, cardiovascular system of a fish, amphibian, reptile, and a mammal. The number of chambers in the heart and the complexity of the circulation varies, as we can see. But we will be focusing on human cardiovascular system. We notice that on mammals, these are closed loop and one-way system. As a comparison, for example, Madagascar hissing cockroaches, which I keep at my lab for some of the experiments that we do in my biology classes. Well, they have a very different cardiovascular system from us. And from what we have usually learned about this system, typically being like. In these cockroaches, the cardiovascular system is an open loop consisting of multiple chambers that make the heart. Rather than blood, it is actually a liquid similar to the lymph that is being circulated, and it travels within the empty spaces of the roach's body instead of closed tubing made by the blood vessels. But as I said, our focus will be on the humans. So to get us oriented, let's look at the human heart and cardiovascular system as well as a whole. First of all, we see that we have a heart and we have two types of blood flowing in the system. The blood returning to the heart from most of the body is deoxygenated, lacking oxygen, and shown in blue color. Notice how the right side of the heart deals with this. While the blood leaving the heart to the body is oxygenated and rich in oxygen and shown in this diagram as red on the left side of the heart. Let's add a little bit more to this diagram. Firstly, we have something known as a pulmonary circuit. This is where the deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart goes to. Pulmonary circuit leads to the lungs, where blood gets oxygenated, and then this blood returns to the same pulmonary circuit and back to the heart. Notice how it enters back on the left side of the heart, this time being oxygen rich. So that is, if you wish, our first loop in the cardiovascular system. And the second loop is when the blood, which is now oxygen rich, leaves the heart from the left side and travels to the rest of the body. There it gives the oxygen to the tissues and returns back to the right side of the heart as deoxygenated, oxygen poor blood. This is systemic circuit. So those are the two loops or circuits that we need to know about our cardiovascular system. Let's have a look at the heart a little more. It is approximately a fist-shaped organ. And this analog to the fist and heart shape is an easy scale for you to use when you compare babies and adults and want to have a rough scale to look at the differences in the size of their hearts. And here I have added some outlines around this previous drawing that we saw. See how most towards us we can see this big muscular wall covering most of the view. Now we have removed the drawing, leaving just outlines. And I did this for a reason. I want to show you how the heart, being a hollow organ, it really has a cone-like shape. Like here. The big muscular walls hide inside two cone-shaped chambers. And we will have a closer discussion on those in a minute. But what I want to highlight here is that a lot of the heart is made of this muscular wall. That is what makes it into this pump which drives the flow of blood in a cardiovascular system. Let's look at the location of the heart. It is located within the thorax, fairly medially, in a space called mediastinum, just between the lungs. And of course, the heart is also located above the diaphragm. In terms of landmarks that you can see also externally, between the ribs 2 and 5, notice also how the apex of the heart, that is the most inferior and anterior tip, you can think of it as the sharp end point of the heart. Notice how it is pointing left of the midline, inferiorly and left. And let's return back to having a look of the structures inside the heart. For this, we will return to this picture. It is the same, just slightly enlarged from what we saw earlier on our discussion of the pulmonary and systemic lobes. What we see here are the internal hollow spaces inside the heart. These are chambers of the heart. And there are 4 of these in total. And we need to have a look at those. Let's review the chambers of the heart. On the top, so that is the most superior part, the 2 chambers that we have are known as atria. These are chambers where the blood gets collected to and builds up. So we have one on the right and one on the left side of the heart. And we also have ventricles. These are more inferior and larger in size. And they are where we have these powerful muscular walls, which I mentioned earlier. So they pump the blood out from the heart. And again, we have one on the right and one on the left side. Let's go back to this view. And what I want to discuss with you next and show with this figure is that the heart is located in a mediastinum inside a sac. This is our pericardium. And we will look at the pericardium in a little more detail next. Before that though, I do want to mention about the terminology that the term myocardium instead refers to the cardiac muscle wall and was a significant focus of my research career. But back to the pericardium. So here we see this enlarged view of the heart wall, which we zoomed into already earlier. And we will also see these pericardial structures. So we can see the heart wall with its many components. And then notice how the pericardium is made of 2 layers. Parietal, which is also known as fibrous layer, and visceral layer, which is also known as epicardium. And in between those, we have pericardial cavity, which is filled with a fluid that lubricates these 2 layers as they slide past each other. This is what allows the heart to move so effortlessly, contracting and expanding, although it is located in the small space in between the lungs. And this brings me to talk about one clinical condition that is important for us to note. Pericarditis. So those of you who have already taken your medical terminology classes might remember that a word ending in itis was always an inflammation of something. And this is the case, and this time it's going to be an inflammation of the pericardial cavity. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Pericarditis is a condition that we would hear with a stethoscope. It sounds like this crackling sound as the rough membrane surfaces rub against each other. I want to go back to this diagram just briefly, just to highlight the different layers of the heart now that we have dealt with the pericardium. Epicardium is the outermost layer, myocardium, the thick, fleshy middle part, and endocardium, the innermost layer of the heart. And this is just a reminder from our BIO181 or BIO156, whichever class you took as the basic introductory biology course. Remember that there were 3 general muscle tissue types. And it is going to be the cardiac muscle that we are especially interested in here. Remember, this is a muscle type where the cells are branching and connecting to other cardiac muscle cells through intercalated discs. This is in order to synchronize the contractions. And these had one central nucleus per cell and had striations. So I want to mention a few further details that are characteristic for cardiac muscle cells. First, there is going to be a lot of mitochondria in these cardiac muscle cells. These cells were highly active. Remember how we spoke at the beginning of the video about the heart never being at rest. So these muscle cells need a lot of energy. Another important characteristic was, as I mentioned already earlier on, these intercalated discs at the ends of these branching cardiac muscle cells, where they connected to their other peers. This was important as we want cells that make a heart muscle mass at one area to contract simultaneously. Note that the heart muscle is independent and not under voluntary control. So you do not need to think about, now I am going to have my heart contracting. Instead, this self-excitable characteristic of the heart is controlled by pacemaker cells, which then oversee the contracting cells. Also note that the heart muscle of one area contracts as one unit. And there are a lot of chemical messengers and information that we can detect about the heart states from the blood. So, for example, in case of a cardiac infarction. Finally, if you think back of our action potential in a nervous cell, you will see that in case of cardiac muscle cells, there is a longer recovery time in order to allow a heart chamber to fill. One last thing, heart only uses aerobic respiration. While you might remember from the skeletal muscles that sometimes we could resort to anaerobic respiration, which resulted in the buildup of lactic acid. In aerobic respiration of the heart, a lack of oxygen would be very much of a problem. But that's enough of these extra details on the heart. Let's return back to this diagram that we saw earlier. And we remember that there were 4 chambers that we need to know. These were right atrium, right ventricle, and then left atria and left ventricle. If you want to simplify things, you could even draw a heart like this. The key thing here is the 4 chambers and their locations. And we could, I guess, add the flow of the blood into this diagram too. First, to the right atrium from the rest of the body. Then, to the right ventricle, and from there, the blood gets pumped into the lungs. Then blood comes back from the lungs to the left atrium, from where it gets pumped to the left ventricle and further back to the rest of the body. So knowing the chambers and what goes where is going to be important for us. Let's go back to this diagram. A couple of things that I want to say here. Notice that atria are more superficial chambers. They are the chambers that receive blood, maybe from the systemic or pulmonary circulation. Kind of like collecting sites. An important structure on them that results from the role of theirs and that I want to highlight is these auricles. They increase the volume of the atria by being at rest like these flappy extensions of the sacs, but having capacity to expand as atria fills with blood, providing extra space for the blood to build into. Then we should have a look at the ventricles. They are more inferior, and their function is to shoot out the blood from the heart, like we just saw with our box diagram of the heart. So blood leaves from there to the lungs or to the rest of the body. So the pulmonary system or systemic circulation. And the inside walls of these ventricles are lined with trabecular carne. These are irregular ridges that prevent blood from getting stuck somewhere there inside the wall layer and clotting inside the heart. Finally, one more structure that I want to point out here. This wall that separates the two ventricles is known as the septum. And because it is between the two ventricles, it's called interventricular septum. Let's return back once again to this initial diagram without any extra labels. A few things that I want to highlight here. Let's shift our focus on valves, which allow flow of blood one way, but prevent the backward flow the other way. So these play a key role in ensuring the unidirectional flow of the blood in the heart. So one-way flow. Firstly, we have two AV valves, which separate the atria and ventricle on each side of the heart. Therefore, they're named accordingly as right and left AV valves. And here I have added a picture of the heart, this time looking down, with the big blood vessels coming out of it having been removed. This way we can see all four valves as if looking from top down. Let's observe a little closer as this relates to the AV valves. Sometimes you might find that the right AV valve is also called tricuspid valve. This is because of it is made of three leaflets, three cusps, so tricuspid. And on the left side, the left AV valve is sometimes called bicuspid valve. For the same reason, there are two cusps on this wall. Another name that is sometimes used is the mitral valve, just so that you're aware of these names. So that's our AV valves. Now I want us to look at our two valves that separate ventricles from the vessels where they pump blood into. And these would be pumping blood to the lungs via pulmonary trunk on the right side. So this would be called pulmonary valve. And on the left side, the valve that separates left ventricle from aorta would be called aortic valve. Interestingly, just like AV valves had, these valves have a common name. They are known as semilunar valves. Semi referring to partial and lunar to the moon. So they look like half moon when it comes to their leaflets. So there we have our four valves. Note that there is no need for the valves where the blood vessels enter the atria on either side. And while we are talking about valves, I want to mention some clinical relevance. So we can have issues with the valve having failed and resulting in backflow. In this case, the heart is not achieving its function of pumping blood in a one-way manner, but ends up repumping the same blood back and forth. So this is not effective. Or we can have a valve that has narrowed. So here we have insufficient opening of the valve. And as a result, in this case, the heart needs to contract more forcefully to pass enough blood. So that would not be good either. How to treat these? Well, you could replace the valve either by mechanical, animal, or catheter-originating replacement valve. And while we will discuss the bath of blood in another video, there is something that I want to point out from this diagram that we saw earlier. When we compare the pulmonary system and systemic circulation, there is a lower pressure in pulmonary valve. This is because there is lesser distance to travel, and we do not want to burst the vessels at the lungs by forcing blood too forcefully to this shorter loop. While systemic circulation has a longer distance to cover, essentially all rest of the body, so there is higher pressure there to start with. Arteries, which we will look at in the next chapter, are thick and elastic and can handle this, and even have some smooth muscle in the wall to regulate the blood pressure. And then the veins, after the pressure has dropped, and these are thin from their walls and focus on bringing blood back to the heart. Before we finally wrap up this video, I want to talk a little bit about the surface anatomy of the heart and coronary circulation. Let's start with the surface anatomy. I will highlight only a few ones. So we have various sulci that we will notice. And from our discussion of the topography of the brain, you remember that this term referred to the grooves. And these are important anatomical landmarks when we look at the surface of the heart and, for example, where the coronary arteries would lie in. So let's see them in a picture. So the atrioventricular groove, the depression that separates the atria and ventricle, is our first one. Here it is where the coronary arteries first appear and run along this groove on both left and right side. So this groove has been named as coronary sulcus. Next we have depression that separates the ventricles on the anterior side. This is known as anterior interventricular sulcus. And finally, we have one on the posterior side. Again, separating ventricles. This is, not surprisingly, posterior interventricular sulcus. So those are the important sulci to know. Finally, I said that I want to still talk about coronary circulation. So if the heart is constantly at work, where does it get the energy and nutrients that the cardiac muscle cells need for their tireless work? Yes, it must have its own blood supply. And it must have its own blood vessels. And this is what much of my research focused on the three main vessels and how they supply different regions of myocardium and how we can see that in the living and in patients with myocardial injury. What you are seeing here are the blood vessels of the human heart, and we will be focusing on arteries. In fact, these coronary arteries are the first arteries that arise right after the aortic valve. I like that statement as an exam question, just saying. And this is in response to the fact that 1/20 of the body's blood supply goes to the heart. And rather interestingly, this functional blood supply to the heart itself is the shortest circulation in the body. And blood is delivered to these coronary arteries when the heart is relaxed. And it is the left ventricle's surface that receives most of the coronary supply. Coronary circulation ensures that the nutrients and oxygen are brought to the cardiac muscle and that the carbon dioxide and waste products are taken away. In most people, there is a left dominance of these arteries, which wrap around the heart. However, it is possible that there are different kinds of bypasses if needed. Let's have a look at three important coronary arteries. Firstly, on the left coronary artery. It arises from the aorta, arching clockwise to the anterior side, where it divides into left anterior descending artery, which runs in the interventricular groove towards the apex of the heart, and the second branch, left circumflex artery. Left circumflex artery follows the line between left atria and ventricle, arching to the posterior side of the heart. Right coronary artery arises instead on the opposing side of the aorta, running in the groove between right atria and ventricle, arching to the posterior side. And there are a number of coronary veins, but I will leave those for you to study independently. So that's it for this video, which covered quite a bit. I hope you found it useful. Now that we have a good appreciation of the heart anatomy, in the next video, our focus will be shifting even more to the physiological aspects of the heart.